Good evening, everybody. I hope I am coming through. I sorry about the delay. Some significant technical difficulties here. So anyway, I had just had a 20 minutes of IT, and it's late. So let me cut straight to the chase, and I'm happy. I'm delighted to take a few questions. Presumably, if you're on right now, you watched the same speech that I did. Let me give you two reactions. Number one, for an institution that is still pretty emotionally charged around what happened in that chamber on January 6th, I found the president's tone really important. He didn't attack anybody. He did not attack anybody at all. Not a Republican. In fact, he actually name checked Mitch McConnell and was constructive. And from a policy standpoint, this is the second thing I'll say. Um, I don't think he said anything, and this is not the standard by which we judge policy, but I don't think he said anything that doesn't have majority support amongst the American population. And why do I say that? Because again, that's not necessarily the test for policy, although it's darn important in a democracy. I say that because um, it doesn't give the other side, Republicans, a lot of areas to say, Biden is crazy on this plan or it'll never work. Now, of course, I was doing IT when I might have been watching Senator Tim Scott's response. There's no doubt they're going to say that those plans cost too much. Interestingly enough, though, as Joe Biden said, all of his plans, he has proposed a way to pay for them. And that way, and again, this isn't the be all end all, but that way is very popular with the American people, which is to ask the wealthiest people in this country and corporations to pay their fair share. So I say all that not to talk about the nature of the policies he proposed, which I happen to think are really important, but that it was to somebody who was in that chamber on the 6th, a non-confrontational, non-attacking, come together kind of speech. And that means a lot to me on the considering what happened on the 6th. In terms of the policy, and then I'm delighted to take a few questions. I'm conscious of the fact that it's very late. But in terms of the policy, having noted that I think everything he said comes with a lot of bipartisan support, universal background check, investment in education, making it equal pay for women. I didn't hear him say anything that doesn't command pretty substantial popular support. For this guy, and I tend to be policy oriented, maybe even a policy wonk, to hear a presidential address in which the president spends a lot of time on the urgency of education, training, and research and development. And I cluster all those things together because those things are the investment that we make in our economic prosperity and in our people. I never imagined I would hear a president in a joint session of Congress explain to the American people what DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, stands for. But he's making a point that government investment in basic research, not necessarily in consumer research, but in basic research, led, as he said, to the development of the internet, to GPS, to untold numbers of vaccines and medical advances. So to this policy wonk, to hear about those investments and for the president to make a comparison between the physical investments that our forebears made, he mentioned the railroads and the highway system, to the importance of making those investments in the brains and education and training of the American people was pretty exciting to me. So again, I come away from that speech, and this is, I suspect I may be the only one on this Facebook Live who actually was up close and personal to the insurgency on January 6th. The tone and the outreach and the fact that he stayed away from profoundly divisive issues, even those issues which have significant support in the Democratic Party, I think was a real mitzvah for the American people in terms of trying to recenter our democracy in something resembling decency. So anyway, those are my impressions. Let me take a few questions. I'm going to try to navigate this a little better than I have to date. I'll try to be quick too, because this is not a terribly interactive medium. So what does COVID relief, Sharon asked, what does COVID relief mean for municipal budgets? COVID relief and the American Rescue Plan, which he didn't talk a lot about except at the beginning, um, states and municipalities will be receiving very substantial dollars to make sure not just that the expenses that they bore, they had to buy a lot of PPE, they had to buy in some cases equipment, they had to hire people to specialized medical personnel. Those expenses will be paid out of the American Rescue Plan. And the American Rescue Plan has funds that will allow our towns and our state to close the gap in revenues that exist because economic activity got pretty badly damaged in 2020. So I spent a lot of time in other Facebook Lives talking about the American Rescue Plan, but this will not continue off into the future. But Connecticut and other states are very fortunate right now in that the federal government has sent very, very substantial relief with respect to COVID. Okay, Kelsey asked, can we bring back the Fairness Act? Okay, the president didn't really talk about that tonight, but it's a really important issue, so I'm not gonna brush off the question. Yes, we could bring back the Fairness Act, but that's not really the issue. The Fairness Act basically said that if you're using the public airwaves, because we used to get our media through the use of public airwaves, that you had certain obligations to present both sides of a political issue, to be fair. The problem is, of course, we receive our media today over private networks. In fact, I'm talking to you, I'm sure, over one of the ISP's private networks. And so the government doesn't have quite the same purchase to require providers of media to be fair as they used to. That's why, for example, Fox News, which is a cable channel, doesn't have the fairness doctrine applied to it. Now, there's a whole other conversation there, and I'll just touch on it around trying to get the social media companies either through regulation or whatever it may take to be thoughtful about their algorithms, which in many cases amplify misinformation that are in some senses, wired to the dopamine centers of our brain, feed us the information that raises our passions because that leads to more clicks. We have a lot of work to do in that area. But again, the president didn't talk about it a lot tonight, so I'm going to leave that one there. David asks, how do hardcore conservatives not understand the importance of infrastructure? First of all, David, I would say they do. They do. You can't understand anything about our history, and a lot of conservatives come from the South. So if you know anything about the Tennessee Valley Authority and the dramatic transformation that the subsequent electrification of the South through the Tennessee Valley Authority and some other measures had to do. They get that. They get that. But the problem is they either say, okay, I'm for infrastructure, but I'm not going to support any of the mechanisms to pay for it. We saw that here in Connecticut, right? 2 years ago, there was a proposal to do what every state around us has done, which is to put tolls in place so that people driving through Connecticut contribute to our infrastructure. And Connecticut said no. And the Republicans, conservatives, as you asked about, just said no. So the problem is more that they're just not interested in paying for it. And that at some point is a real problem. The other thing is that sometimes they say, well, states should do this. I think that's sort of silly. Economies are regional, right? Our economy here is profoundly affected by New York's economy, to some extent by Massachusetts. And so anyway, it's not that they don't understand it. It's that they're just not, that interested in paying for it. And they'd rather spend the money to provide tax cuts to corporations or to grow the Defense Department budget. So, okay, let me leave that one there. Gina asks, how do you intend to get Biden to stop fracking? So that's a complicated question. I don't think Biden is going to stop fracking for two reasons, and this is a huge question. Fracking is a very dirty way, obviously, to extract energy, natural gas, which is cheaper than many other alternatives. So coal. If you care about carbon footprints, you would choose natural gas over coal. Fracking happens to be a very dirty and in some cases dangerous way of doing it. But without riffing too much on that, I have not heard Joe Biden say that he's going to end fracking. What I've heard him say is let's accelerate the move towards true sustainability, which is perhaps not as fast as many people would like, but is a way, of course, to move on from all carbon-based energy sources. And so what you see in the American jobs plan is a massive commitment of many billions of dollars, tens of billions of dollars, to the infrastructure for sustainability. And you heard him say it tonight. Why can't we make? He was talking about Pennsylvania, actually. Why can't we make turbine blades in Pittsburgh? That, I think, is his perceived path to ending ultimately carbon-based energy. Okay, Peter asks, how will you get SALT deductions back? This is something we're pushing hard on. I'm not a big believer in legislative ultimatums. In other words, some of my colleagues have said if a complete removal of the SALT caps are not in the bill, I will vote no on it. You got to be a little careful about that because there's so much else good in the bill. But I've been pushing pretty hard for a restoration of the world in which we didn't have caps on state and local taxes. That's really important to the state of Connecticut, to New York, to Massachusetts, to California. What do those states have in common? Those states have people that want, substantial public investment for good schools, for nice parks, for good roadways. They also, by the way, if you think about those states, are states in which the economies are really rocking and rolling. And I don't believe you should punish those states where you actually have the economic engines of the country because they choose to tax themselves to provide good public education, good public services. Anyway, stay tuned. This is very much an ongoing conversation. Jeffrey asks, will ARP drive jobs back to Connecticut? Yes, it most certainly will. The American Rescue Plan, so ARP stands for American Rescue Plan, that's passed already. The American Jobs Plan, which is not yet passed, it was just announced a few weeks ago. The kinds of investments that get made in sustainable energy in particular, electrification, electric vehicles, building out charging stations, that's pretty advanced manufacturing. That's what we do here in the state of Connecticut. We tend not to do a lot of lower end manufacturing, metal bending, as they used to say. We do a lot of very high end manufacturing. And by the way, that's things like turbines and those sorts of things. If you can build a jet engine, you can build a turbine. The technology is actually pretty similar, and we build a lot of jet engines in Hartford, Connecticut. So yes, it will be a very good thing for the state of Connecticut. Steve asks, do you believe in reinstating the Equal Time Act? You got me, Steve. I'm not sure I know what the Equal Time Act is. If you want to enter that into the comments, and I apologize, there's just an awful lot of different bills floating around there. If you want to elaborate on that, I'll try to answer it. Heidi asks, are there any plans for Connecticut to divert funds from police to social justice? So I'm actually visiting the Stanford Police Department on Monday to talk with the chief about a program that Stanford is pioneering, I think, where they are going to, every time there is a call that involves somebody in psychological or emotional distress, they are going to send a mental health professional with the police officers who turn up. And the theory there is that, which I think is really smart, which is that you have somebody on scene who is trained in both identifying and de-escalating a situation where you may have somebody in distress, somebody who's suicidal, somebody who has gone off their medications, whatever it may be. You can train police officers to know a little bit about that, but given the breadth of their mission, that's not their specialty. So the answer to your question is yes, and I'm glad you asked it because I'm going to get a good look at what Stanford is trying to pioneer. And look, there's a lot. It's not just Stanford, right? There's a lot of municipalities and states that are realizing that particularly in those cases where you have somebody in emotional or psychological distress, you do want a professional there who is trained to de-escalate. And it doesn't always mean that you're not going to need the force involved in a police officer, but I think that could be a real improvement in our policing. Let's see here, a couple more questions. Let's see. Which of Biden's plans, Katie asks, are you most excited about? And I'm sorry, as I reread Heidi's questions here, the question was actually not, I may have allowed Monday to over-influence me. The question was divert funds from police to social justice. Let me, having spent a lot of time on the question of mental health care, look, we shouldn't choose between good policing and social justice. Those, in some ways, are the same thing, right? So I don't want to say we should do anything other than make sure that police are held accountable when they do the kinds of egregious things that we have seen. And again, as the president said, the vast majority of police officers are professionals of honor and dignity, but there are too many police officers who are protected, who are not. Who are bad actors, and there's too many of them that are protected. So I think we should address that problem at the same time that we work in housing and in the legal system more broadly speaking, and the educational system, and I could go on, to try to improve our social justice. Does that mean that we also don't deal with the fact that there is still too much bias in police forces, as there are in many or most or all of our institutions? No, that doesn't mean that, and that also needs to be addressed. But again, I would discourage thinking about needing to we need to do both, right? We need to improve our policing, and we need to, in a much broader way, address equity and social justice issues. Okay. Katie asked, which of Biden's plans are you most excited about? There's a lot there. Look, I'm just beside myself with the very substantial investments that will be made in infrastructure. And I'm not just talking about roads and bridges, right? I'm talking about investments in rebuilding crumbling schools, what the president talked about tonight, taking lead pipes out of our drinking water infrastructure, making sure that everyone in America has access to broadband services, without which you can't really succeed these days. So if you ask me to pick just one thing, I would say that broad commitment in the infrastructure, which leads to economic opportunity and which leads to more people being able to share in the American dream. If you ask me to name one thing, I would probably name that aspect of his plans. Okay, Jay asked, do you think parents who are against vaccines will get their children vaccinated? I've stayed a little bit quiet on this topic because, of course, my colleagues at the state level were legislating on this. I don't know what parents will do. What I can tell you is Connecticut has preserved its medical exemption. And I will also tell you, and this may put me at some odds with some of my colleagues in Hartford, um, uh, religious objections and conscience generally is something to be taken seriously. And that's in our Constitution. Now, the way the law that was passed at Hartford will be tested, should it be litigated, and I think it probably will be, is that when the state overrides an individual's religious beliefs, it is subject to a test of strict scrutiny. I'm sort of playing a lawyer here, even though I'm not one, but I can tell you that strict scrutiny says that there's a two-part test. Number one, is there a public interest? And clearly with vaccines, there is a dramatic public interest. Um, and number two, the second part of that test is the obligation or is the overriding of somebody's religious beliefs the least intrusive method of achieving that public policy aim possible? That's, I think, where Connecticut's blanket prohibition on religious exemptions is likely to be tested. And again, I'm not steeped enough in the court histories here to know how that comes out, but that's likely to be where it's tested. We had this issue. Here's an area where I had to work on this. When we passed the Affordable Care Act and we put an obligation for all employers to provide insurance to their employees, or employers with more than, I guess it was 50 employees, to offer insurance that had certain minimal standards, including contraception. The Affordable Care Act was structured such that the Catholic Church did not need to abide by that, and there was constructed a workaround whereby an insurance plan could be offered by a Catholic institution that did not include contraception, but that there would be an easy method for somebody who was working for a Catholic institution, to go out and get that coverage. So that's an example of making an accommodation to religious preferences. So let me leave that one there, because I think we're going to hear a lot more about that along the way. Okay. Chris asks, will Republicans ever consider supporting Biden's initiatives? I think on some things they will. The challenge, they're not. This does not feel like Obama's second year, in which my Republican colleagues had taken to heart Mitch McConnell's statement that their sole objective was to make Barack Obama a one-term president. The challenge is that I think the bid-ask spread is going to be too big. In other words, so Biden has put out a $2 trillion infrastructure plan. The Republicans are going to come back, or did come back, with something like 700 billion. That's a huge spread, and quite frankly insufficient in my opinion. So I think the challenge is not that they're going to refuse to engage. I just think that the gap between what they're comfortable with and what we're comfortable with, what the president comfortable with, is likely to be too large in many instances to close that gap. But you heard the president tonight. I really was proud of him for saying, get this stuff done, make the compromises, get it done. Okay, a couple more questions here. Kelsey asks, can Democrats come up with a better slogan than saying people need to pay their fair share? It gives the right ammunition to say Democrats are socialist. Kelsey, I disagree with that. I disagree with that because if we say, which we sometimes do, a more punitive line, you hear some people on the left say billionaires are a policy failure. Now that's a whole other conversation. There may be something to that, in that theoretically excess profits in a competitive market disappear pretty quickly. But my point is that there's that saying appealing to fairness, I don't think is socialist. I actually think that appeals to people. Look, the fact is, and Warren Buffett said this best, Warren Buffett, one of the wealthiest men on the planet, pays a lower effective tax rate than his secretary does. I don't care where you are on the political spectrum, you understand that there's a fairness problem in that. So I think appeals to fairness are probably more politically viable than punitive statements, or other ways of talking about this. So look, we Democrats are not always awesome at messaging, so I say that with some humility, but I think appeals to fairness of making sure, bottom line, folks that are doing extraordinarily well, and the president laid it out in black and white, the wealthiest families in this country have grown their wealth enormously in the last year, saying, hey guys, you had a massive windfall when we were in a huge pandemic. Time to step up. Yeah, I think that has fairly broad appeal. Okay. Celia, how are my bees doing? My bees are doing fine. Thank you very much. Hoping for a big season of lots of honey. Maureen asks about term limits. I get asked about term limits a lot, and I try to give people pretty direct answers. I've always been a little I have not had a ton of conviction on term limits, and in fact, I generally oppose them. And here's why. Look, I understand why people say there should be term limits. There are people who hang around in office longer than they should. Believe me, I spend time with these people, so I see that. But here's my problem, and here's why I probably lean slightly against term limits. Number one, I sort of believe in uplifting the choice of the voter. And, in this country, we have elections. And if, a majority of people don't want somebody in office, they'll take that person out of office. So it sort of feels funny to me to take choice away from voters. And secondarily, and here, this in some ways is perhaps more serious. I've been in the Congress for a while now, and I will tell you that there are elected members who get pulled in 70 different directions over the course of a week. Social Security, Syria, Iran, Medicare, student loan relief. And then there's the professional staff, and the professional staff are extraordinary. They often know their subject cold better than the members and senators in some cases, and they've been doing it forever, and they're an essential part of the thing. But they're not elected. They're not accountable to the voters. And if you take people out of the Congress, after 8-10 years, whatever it is, it takes you a few years just to sort of figure out how it all works and how to make it happen. If you start taking people out, what happens is you shift authority inevitably away from elected representatives to the professional staff. Now, again, the professional staff is very, very good generally, very good, but they're not elected and they're not accountable. So that's why I probably come out certainly wishy-washy, but a little bit lean against the concept of term limits. Not a wild idea though, right? The president has term limits. There's certainly plenty of state offices where they have term limits. Stephen, and maybe we'll close up with this one because it's after 11. But Stephen asks, are you in support of getting rid of qualified immunity for cops? So I did support the George Floyd policing bill in the Congress, which would get rid at the federal level for federal police officers qualified immunity. And my understanding, and here let me wade into the state level thing because you're really asking, since the police are run and managed and funded and regulated by states, I'm gonna sort of step into an area here that is more a state issue. But in Connecticut, while it was enormously controversial, The reduction on qualified immunity basically said if you're a police officer and you knowingly and maliciously, and there are a bunch of other words there. Again, I wasn't voting and debating on this in Hartford, but knowingly and grossly negligently and maliciously commit an action, then you have civil liability. Guess what? You and I, if we knowingly and gross negligently do something wrong, we have civil liability. And we don't have an authorization to use lethal force. So it's not an unreasonable idea. I think the notion that it's going to lead to widespread, failure to recruit police officers is not likely to be true. We're not seeing that. But I would urge you to have this conversation with your state representatives, your state senators, because they are a little closer to what actually happened with the policing here in the state of Connecticut. Let's see. Let me take one or two others here. Lisa Ann, I don't know if Lisa Ann is still on, 18 minutes ago asked, where do you stand on protecting military service members from sexual assault and sexual harassment? That's a no-brainer. Women and everybody, all Americans, serve honorably and with great distinction and deserve to be celebrated for their military service. And nobody, no woman, nobody in the military should ever be subject to sexual assault or sexual harassment. And the reality is that they still are. They still are. The military culture has changed somewhat as women have assumed a larger role in the military, but the culture has not changed nearly enough. And by the way, Kirsten Gillibrand, any number of others are doing really good work in making sure that that culture does change over time. And by the way, that's not just true in the military; that's true in any profession. Leanne asks, will Congress do a 9/11 style commission regarding the January 6th siege? I certainly hope so. Pelosi made a whole bunch of concessions to the Republicans. She did not concede. My Republican friends wanted this commission to also look at other forms of violence, because every time January 6th comes up in which they were complicit, in some instances, they say, well, what about Antifa? Okay, we can talk about Antifa, but we need a commission that just looks at what happened on January 6th. Because in my opinion, that was as big a challenge, as the president said tonight, to our democracy that we have seen since the Civil War. Sharon, watch The Social Dilemma. I did watch it. Thank you. Very, very compelling. Okay. I'm glad, Lisa, that you elaborated on the Military Justice Improvement Act, but we talked about sexual harassment here. Tom asks, why do some of my very smart friends get caught up in the conspiracy hogwash? It's a really great question. The best I can do is to say that our politics have become more about identity and tribalism than they have become about policy differences. And quite frankly, I hold my Republican colleagues more responsible for that than Democrats. Why do I say that? Am I just being partisan? No, I'm not. In the last Republican presidential convention, they chose to not have a policy platform and instead said, we will support Donald Trump regardless. Again, I'm not being partisan here. They chose not to have a policy platform. They chose to say, we are not about this set of beliefs. We are about this one man. And this man, that man, Donald Trump, was about dividing us into warring camps. And so it's become about identity. And so if you're really more concerned about tribalism and identity, the question is, what do you believe? Well, too many of those folks still believe that the election was stolen from Donald Trump. Too many of them believe in some wacky conspiracy hogwash, as you put it, about vaccines being somehow transmitting infertility. But it has something to do with people giving up their analytical, critical thinking processes in favor of being part of a group that has this very strong identity. All right, I should probably not wander into psychotherapy that way, but I did. Okay, let's see, a couple more. It's getting pretty late, folks. Steve says, save Flint. Absolutely. My good friend Dan Kildee is all over that. Katie Boland is on. Congratulations on the Trumbull Highs We the People team. I saw that all over social media. Great stuff. What else have we got here? Okay. All right, folks, that seems to be all the questions. I'm glad to get some comments there from everybody else, but it's late. And I appreciate you all joining for the conversation. We'll do more of these. Thank you, everybody, and good night.